Hi, my name is Ross Baker. I'm the president of the Tualatin Historical Society. I'm thrilled to bring you the first of two-part series about Tualatin from the beginning, a book that Loyce, another co-founder of the Historical Society, wrote when we first got started. Today we're going to be talking about the early years of Tualatin when it was founded in the middle of the 1800s and take you up to the turn of the century, not this past century, but the 1900s. And Sandra Lafke will continue next month with Tualatin during Loyce's lifetime, which recently was 90 years. Congratulations, Loyce.
I made it.
Yeah, you made it, yay. Not only is she the co-founder of the Historical Society, as I mentioned, but she's an author, she's a playwright, she is also known as the singing cowgirl. She's had a lot of things going on, very, very busy life, and is well positioned to answer some of these questions about Tualatin. And I'm going to get started at the very beginning, well, relative beginning, the Ice Age. Could you comment on how the Ice Age had some impact on Tualatin?
Well, there have been plenty of ice ages, at least 5, and we are still, as a matter of fact, in an ice age because there are still some glaciers. But about 15,000 years ago, there was a warming of the country, and there was a big ice lake up in Idaho that melted and broke and sent the water rushing down through Idaho, Canada, Idaho, and Washington into the Willamette Valley, bringing with it enormous boulders. And we not only had the boulders that came down through the Ice Age floods, the floods also dug down in places into, oh gosh, it's where the soil ends. Dead, anyway, I can't remember it. Darn it, that's what you get for being 90 years old. I know that as well as I know my own name, but I can't remember it. But where we live in Lake Oswego, the water sloshed around really hard and got down to bedrock. That's what I was thinking of, bedrock. So in our yard, we have enormous stones. And the soil is horrible because it's been all washed away. Very, very thin soil. But here in this area, oh, it's left the richest soil. And some people say that the Willamette Valley, if it were farmed properly, could feed the world. Unfortunately, we have a lot of roads, industry, and concrete that kind of keep us from that. But this was a precious place, a precious place.
Thank you.
And, I want to say about the Tonkin Scablands, also rocks were deposited down there. You know, it was like 400 feet high over here, the water, just rushing down, swirling around. And they went on, there were several little floods like that, but they just scoured the good land of Idaho and Washington and brought it down to us.
Thank you, Idaho. More than just potatoes, huh?
Pardon me?
Idaho gave us more than just potatoes.
Yes, right.
So talk a little bit about the first people in Tualatin. Let's fast forward a few thousand years.
Yes, a few thousand years, during the last ice age, so much water was taken up in ice, was frozen, that there were big land bridges. The land bridge from Siberia, the Bering Strait over to Alaska, was 90 miles wide, and people from Siberia and that area came down and inhabited the whole United States, most especially this precious Willamette Valley.
And I think for those of us who've lived in Tualatin long enough, we're familiar with the names Atfalati and Kayupuya. What's the difference between those two tribes?
Well, Atfalatis were a group of the Kalapuya. The Kalapuya natives, I hate when I call them Indians. They're not Indians, they're native people. The Kalapuyans occupied the entire Willamette Valley, and the Atfalati were a group of those. There were several groups.
So the Kayupuya, they were the Atfalati were a subset of the Kayupuya tribe.
Yes, and they were a linguistic group. Those groups could all talk together.
Okay.
You know, their dialects were somewhat different, but they could all communicate, and they were linguistically related.
So the Atfalati, they were the ones who lived around the Tualatin area?
Absolutely.
What was life like for them in our area?
Well, you know, it was pretty good. This area was for those people, it was just wonderful. There was plenty of game, plenty of food. The weather was mild. They did very, very well. There was a village, I think there were probably several villages. There's one over by Fano Creek, where Fano Creek comes into the Tualatin River, and I think somebody found a bowl there for where they did the mortar and
Pestle.
scraping the seeds, you know. And my dad said that there were just, oh, I'll tell you that next month.
Okay.
Yes, there were definitely Native Americans here,
Okay.
living very well off the land, and they didn't need the horse because they could get along just fine. They had canoes going down the river, or they had trails. They had lots of trails, and they just walked by foot. They were a happy group. Yeah, they were here.
Did they live in this area year-round?
Well, sometimes somebody did, and sometimes they went to Wapato Lake over in Gaston, and they would dig for roots, and they had kind of tents there where they would live during the winter and kind of commune with each other.
And the camas root that they dug up, what was the purpose of that?
Well, they would cook it and eat it, bake it, and Wapato also. And they would bake it and then dry it, and they fed very well. They were, the pictures that we have of them, they were well nourished.
I remember reading in your book that they also use that for trading. What did they
yes.
need to trade for?
Well, trade for obsidian, because we had no obsidian here. So, you know, Oregon City at the falls was a meeting place for all the Native people. And so they would go every year at a certain time and to the falls, and they would trade, and they would make marriage contracts and so on, because they knew about you couldn't marry your sister, you know, they knew that. So they would marry, you know, have marriages arranged with other groups. And they would trade and they would commune, you know, it was a good time for them, it was a party time for them.
What were some of the things they were trading for?
Well, obsidian, like I say,
Yeah.
once, and salmon, because our Tualatin River doesn't have salmon in it, but there's a salmon in the Willamette, and salmon was one of their main foodstuffs, but they had to trade for it. They had trout and other fish in the rivers, but the salmon was a good feeder for them. Provided a lot of calories and a lot of body heat. So that was a good food for them.
Now, you had mentioned that the Tualatin were also slave traders.
Yes, that's true.
Let's talk about that for a minute.
Well, I don't know too much about it, except that they did collect slaves from the coast area. And one thing about the Tualatin, they had head flattening as one of their beauty products, but the slaves didn't. So if a slave had a nice round head, they knew it was a slave. I mean, if a man had a nice round head, it was a slave, because the Tualatin did practice head lengthening, head flattening, they call it.
How did they do that?
Well, they had a board that they kind of attached to the baby's head, and it just kind of pushed the skull back instead of letting it grow back.
Interesting. When did they first encounter Europeans or white people?
Well, Europeans, of course, in the 1700s would explore along the coast, the Pacific coast, and there was some interaction between them, and they were introduced to then the white man's plagues, influenza, measles, all sorts of things that they had no
Immunity.
immunities. Yes. 90 years old, I don't remember every word, but I remember the basic facts.
Now, somehow, it's suggested in your book that even the word Tualatin itself is derived from the name of the Tualatin.
Tualatin, of course it is. Tualatin, a fall, it's the same. We don't know how they pronounced it, but at the Tualatin, it means the Tualatin, means the name of the river.
Interesting. And we're going to go back to the first white people that were here, how did their arrival in our area impact the local native peoples?
Well, fur trading was the big thing that got people into Oregon, fur trading. The Hudson Bay Fur Company up in Canada sent trappers down, and they trapped beaver and traded with other countries and so on. What else did you ask me?
I was just wondering, all these white people moving into the area, it certainly had an impact.
Oh my gosh, did it ever?
In addition to the diseases that you mentioned.
Oh gosh, I'm trying to get my dates strong right here. In 1840, I don't know if you know who Ewing Young was, but he was a very early settler in Oregon, kind of over by Newburgh. And this area was where there were trappers that had decided to settle down here because the land was so rich, so good to farm, and the fur trade was kind of dying off a little bit and not so important. And so Ewing Young went down to California and came on the Loyce and came up with a herd of cattle. And so the people here, the settlers here, could use those cattle, buy those cattle. They were wild and high-headed, as my father would say, high-headed. And he said that some of Ewing Young's cattle were one time in the 30s or 20s or 30s, were stuck in one of the barns here, and they couldn't hold them in because they were so high-headed.
And that means they were crazy?
Yeah, they were wild cattle.
Yeah.
You've seen the horns like that, But Ewing Young, he was the one who had a great deal to do with the settling of Oregon. He died with quite a large, income, and they had no laws here to settle that. What do you do when somebody dies? You go to a lawyer, you do all that stuff. Well, there was nothing, and so people got together and decided, they needed to do something about this because more and more people were coming into the valley. And so they got together at Champoeg, which was kind of a trading place, and they all gathered together, the trappers and a few the farmers. Most of them were trappers, so. And they decided they needed to have a government of some kind to settle estates like Ewing Young's. And so there were the French Canadians, and then there were Americans. And so Joe Meek, who was famous, Joe Meek apparently said, "Divide, divide, who's for a divide? All those on the American side step forward." They divided up equally. And then two of the French Canadians stepped over into the American line. And some people say that Joe Meek liquored those guys up first, but we don't know that. But anyway, then it became American property, and Joe Meek went back to Washington, and they set up a government at Champoeg.
Those were known as the wolf meetings, is that correct?
Oh, absolutely, because wolves wolves were going after Ewing Young's cattle. Ewing Young had a lot of cattle, and with nobody there to take care of them, the wolves were running them down, and so they wanted to handle the wolves, but the real reason was they wanted to establish this area for America.
Now, before we leave the Ewing Young, it's my understanding he didn't bring these high-headed cattle up here just to be a nice guy. He was actually selling them.
Oh yes, he made a good profit at it.
And I don't remember exactly, but you actually mentioned the price in your book. It was something.
I can't remember what it was.
It was like
either.
$100. It was something that seemed very high for the time.
Well, the people needed cows. Mm-hmm. The settlers that were here, they needed cattle both for milk, meat, and work, because oxen could pull the plow.
I'm going to change the channel a little bit. I want to talk about some of the first people that came here for the donation land claim. Before we go down a little list of some of the more important names that arrived here, why don't you tell us what life was like on the Oregon Trail for those that actually arrived?
It's pretty darn tough. And the trail was unbroken. When the Donation Land Claim Act went through in 1851, the area was divided up into square squares, you know, and then divided up. And before 1851, a settler could get a square mile for a man and his wife. After the donation land claim went through, they could only get half that much. So, according to my dad, there were lots of early marriages because some guy, you know, he knew he could get another 360 acres if he married the little girl down the road.
But that in itself, just for clarification, was an important part of Oregon's history in that women could actually participate in
Yes.
the land claim, which I
Yes.
think before then was in other states not the case.
That's right, that's right.
So people are marrying, they're coming here, or even if they get here and they marry, so they can get the bigger land claim.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
square mile is 640
People are
acres.
basically greedy.
In your book, you mentioned 30-odd some people that came here.
Yes.
Some of them we don't know a lot about. They would sign their name with an X, and much more than that we don't know about them. But the ones we do know about, I've selected some of those names, and I want you to share with the group here sort of a mini biography of some of these names which are important to Tualatin history.
yes.
Let's start with Levi Anderson.
Levi Anderson came out, apparently his wife died on the trail. He came in 1852, and he had a couple of kids. And he settled on the land that is now Apache Bluff, which later my great-grandparents purchased. And he was, I believe, the first, oh boy, I didn't study up on that. He was a delegate to the first Oregon meetings, yeah. So then later on, he went to, he had just a cabin, and later on he went up to Eastern Oregon with several other people from around here because they get free land up there. So
Okay.
his wife died on the trail.
Did he remarry once he arrived here? So
We
could
don't
make
know that.
We don't know. Okay. Let's back up just a minute because I just thought of something that I think it would be interesting for the people to hear, and that is, I mean, you couldn't just claim land and then just hang on to it. You had to do something.
You had to apply for a land grant.
Right.
Yes, you did. Now the first people that came, they could get a square mile for a man and wife. They could make their own boundaries. And then when the donation land claim went through, they could get half that much. And the old timers could keep that land, but they had to reapply.
And could you just hang on to the land, or was there something that you actually had to do on or with the land in order to?
Well, you had to prove it up.
And what does prove it up?
Well, have build a building, at least a home and a barn or something, and start to cultivate the land.
And some of them didn't start that process immediately. They would stay in Oregon City, for example.
Yes.
And was there some time limit on proving up the land?
There was, but I don't remember what it was.
Okay. And a lot of them would just come over from Oregon City and work on their land and then go home.
Yes,
or
yes,
Go
yes.
to their temporary
You know, you
place.
can imagine coming out here with children and nothing but a wagon and a couple of oxen and, you know, a little bit of stuff, and looking at this bare ground, lots of big trees, huge, enormous trees. And usually the farmers would plow around the big trees, or if they cut it down, they'd plow around the stump. And then later on, when it was drier, they'd light a fire in it, and my dad used to do that too. Light a fire in that stump to burn it down so that they could plow that land.
The Balls, Isaac and Larkin Ball.
Isaac and Larkin Ball. Isaac Ball's land claim, he came in 1852, and his land claim was right west of here, over by the part of the cemetery, and it was right next to what is now the golf course. And he was the first school teacher in this area.
And did he actually have a school to teach in?
Yes, there was a school building. I believe there's a picture of up there, there's a picture of him standing by the last log of the old school building. I think these pictures were taken in 1900. And the Oregon Historical Society came out and took a lot of early pictures. And, as my father would say, here's another thing. Oh, when we get to someone else, I'll talk about that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Also, the Balls, I don't think Barb is here today, but
Well, the Balls, Isaac Ball and his brother Larkin married two of the Robbins girls. And so they married sisters, and they're all buried here in Winona Cemetery.
And were the relatives of also one of our board members, Barbara
Oh,
Stincher.
absolutely,
Yeah.
Barbara Stincher, you bet. you
And
bet.
there's a family tree up there on the wall, which
Yes.
talks a lot about the Balls,
Yes,
too.
yeah.
Okay. William John Barr.
Barr came from Scotland, he and his wife, and they settled what is now the city of Tualatin, the downtown part of Tualatin. And later on, they sold out and moved. I don't know if they went back to Scotland or what, but what I understand is that they mourned for Scotland. That's about all I know about them.
Did we have a lot of non-Native Americans? Well, let me reword that because we're not talking about Native.
Early on,
Did we have
I
a
think
lot of
most of
people
them-
that weren't Americans that made land claims?
I think most of them were American people.
Yeah, they originated.
Yeah, and the European people came a little later than that.
You remember the name Zenas Brown?
Oh my gosh. Well, you know, Karen and I did a lot of research to write this book. I'm telling you, we researched and researched. We went down to the Oregon, where they keep all the records, and the Oregon Historical Society, and we got all kinds of records. And we got a big map, you know, and they had all the information about all these early settlers. And then along the one wall, they had listed all of the people that came before the donation land claim was instituted. And so we're looking at Zenas Brown. Who's that? So we went and we ordered his information, and we found that he settled here in this area down on the Tualatin River, his area across the river, where Browns Ferry Park is now. And he was a prominent physician, and I guess there weren't too many physicians in this area. He had his office in Oregon City, and he would advertise, you know, he would treat women's problems personally, respectfully, and so on like that. He was an eclectic doctor. And you want me to go on about him?
Sure, why not? He sounds
Well,
interesting.
Of course, we don't know all the little ins and outs. All we know is what we found in these records. That Zenas Brown had a man living with him named Isaac. What's his name?
I don't know.
What's his name?
Isaac? I don't think it's the Isaac that was living with the doctor?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out.
And anyway, he died. And the neighbors got together and they thought there was foul play because the guy owed Brown money and he couldn't pay it back. And he died. And when the neighbors went to see, they said as many lice on his head as hairs. So Brown wasn't taking care of him. And then he died, and Brown was accused of his murder. And when the circuit court came around, they tried him for it, and he got off because they couldn't prove. And we don't even know where this guy is buried, but he's probably buried close down there near Browns Ferry Park. Brown went on to marry the sister of, can't remember, sorry.
So
Anyway, they left. He and his wife left. And later on, a fellow came before we had this building and said he was a relation of Zenas Brown, and he didn't know anything about this. So we were kind, and we told him, but kindly, you know, that his great-grandfather was a crook. Oh God, I hope I don't get super.
crook and a murderer. Pop, maybe.
Maybe.
Here's a name that most of us know, Byram, Edward Byram.
Well, Edward Byram came around the Horn in 1850 on the Washington Irving ship. I know that because in 1959, my mother wrote a series of articles about local history, and she visited the Byram family, who my dad knew real well, and that's what they told him. He came around the Horn, and this was before 1852, so he could get the full, but he did not file for his claim. And so later on, he got married and filed on after the donation land claim, and so only got 325 acres, 320 acres for him and his wife. But he got here early. I think he worked on a claim, but he didn't file for it until later.
Okay, so
But he was a fine human being, and had a really, really fine family. I think Yvonne probably knows some of the Byrams. They're really good people, and his house is still standing
and where is his house?
on Boone's Ferry Road, up on the hill.
And so the only access to land he had was through the marriage of his wife, who had the.
Well, he could have filed alone and gotten 160 acres. But when he filed, he was married, so he got 320.
Okay, gotcha.
My dad said that there were lots of early marriages there. And, I already said that, didn't I? Wait till you're 90 and see if you can remember everything.
Vital Simino?
Well, Seminoles came out on the wagon train with the Sweeks, and they settled here next to the Sweek property on Tualatin Sherwood Road. And Maria Sweek found a wife for Seminole. I can't remember, John Seminole was his name. Vital Seminole.
Yeah.
Chimino, I think, is the proper pronunciation. And
She found him a wife.
yes, and she was Sonora Boone, son of Alfonso, or the other Boone, here at Boone's Ferry in Wilsonville. So she was Sonora, and she was highly desirable person, very, very nice person, a little.
What does that mean, highly desirable? Remembering this is a family show.
She was well respected from a good family, and they had money. They weren't dirt poor like a lot of the people here, unfortunately, were dirt poor. You can imagine people came out on the trail and lost everything and started from scratch. It took them a long time, even with the good soil, to build up any kind of money, or you gotta really, really be impressed with those people. I don't know if any of us would have the guts to do that now.
So, not to get ahead of ourselves,
Yes.
but of these people, especially the first wave people that came out, who did it? Who did it right and actually ended up becoming wealthy or making money in farming? Are there any families that stand out that really somehow pulled together a small?
Well, some of them that got the onion fields over in Sherwood. They dug ditches and drained the land because it was a swamp, a beaver dam, and they grew onions for 100 years or more. Yeah, so they did very well. And then the Galbraiths got the land that crosses the river, right where the bridge is now, on both sides of the river. And Sam Galbraith built a ferry of some sort. We don't know exactly how the ferry was operated. We think maybe that a ferry should take wagons across, and they had just a flat ferry. And some say that they had Indians rowing a boat. Others say that there was like a rope around a tree that the horse would walk around and pull, and that pulled it across. So they did better than a lot of people. They would charge so much, for a wagon, and so much for so many oxen or so on. So they did very well. I would say very well, pretty well for the rest of them. He wasn't just a farmer.
And to be clear, the bridge that we're talking about is the one on Boone's Ferry today, now, just
Yes,
beyond the library.
Yes, that was built later on. Can't remember exactly when. About 4 years later, I guess. Yeah.
And that was a toll bridge, though, I think,
It was
right?
a toll bridge, and they would charge so much for a wagon. Well, so was the ferry, a toll ferry.
And then the government or somebody came in and said, we're going to build a different bridge, and they shut
Yes.
that bridge down, and they had
The
another
city,
bridge?
then the county built a bridge.
County,
Yeah,
okay.
built a better bridge, yeah. But the men in the area got together and built the first bridge.
Okay.
And it was the first bridge on the Tualatin River, so it was called Bridgeport. Then later on, they took that name away because there was another town up the river that was named Bridgeport.
Okay. But now we got a mall instead called Bridgeport. Irwin Cummins?
Irwin Cummins is from New York, and he got a donation land claim on the swamp over there, and
Swamp being like where onions could be grown
yes,
eventually?
we call it the onion swamp.
Uh-huh.
And his son married one of the Galbraith girls, is that right? Yeah. And
Did you say Galbraith girl?
yeah.
Yeah, probably married her for her money because they had the ferry, right?
You know, one thing is that, oh gosh, can't remember. Joe Galbraith met somebody. I think it was some guy that lived up on 65th that he had been with at the War of the Alamo.
Oh, wow.
A long time before. Those are the little things that we picked up
Yeah.
as my mother would and Dad would interview these old people. See, what I know is based on what my mother and father did, and I can't thank them enough for that.
You've told me before that they're the ones who really piqued your interest in history.
Yes.
Yeah. George Day.
Well, he came before the Donation Land Claim Act also, and so he did get a square mile, and he married a painter girl. Let's see.
Her name was Painter, or she was?
Her
a
last
painter?
name was Painter, and she was a daughter of. Oh, it's not right then. It had something to do with James Moore, who had the first sawmill on the Tualatin River, upriver away.
What was that name again? That first sawmill? Did you say Moore?
What did I say it was? Moore's Mill. Moore's Mill was
I'll be
famous.
darned. That's a new one for me. I hadn't heard Moore's Mill.
Yeah, Moore's Mill.
That was the first one, before Psalm, before
Oh,
John L.
yes.
Smith.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, he was before the Donation Land Claim people came out.
Okay,
So he cut down trees and produced the lumber for all the homes that were built, buildings, that were built there. Yeah, he was kind of famous.
and where would Moore's Mill have been located?
Well, I've tried to figure out, and I can't remember. Wouldn't know exactly, but it's along the Tualatin River, closer across Clackamas County.
Okay, so maybe not even within Tualatin city
No,
boundaries
it wasn't within
today.
Tualatin, but it was
Okay.
on the Tualatin River.
Okay. The names that was mentioned earlier, Galbraith, I have Samuel Galbraith, but there you mentioned Joe.
Well, Sam Galbraith had the Donation Land Claim, him and his wife, and one of his grandsons was Joe.
Okay. Perry Goodall?
Mary Goodall, she didn't come from here. She wrote a story about Oswego.
Okay. So that wasn't one of the original land
No,
claims then?
no.
Okay.
But she wrote about Oswego. Or Tiger it was, Tiger. Yeah, she wrote about Tiger.
Another name that'll be familiar to people from Tualatin, Hedges, John Hedges.
Oh, John Hedges, yes. They came out early. Really, really good people. They built a house on Tualatin Sherwood Road that our association here took down and tried to save for the lumber to build it somewhere else, and we couldn't manage to do that. But yeah, he was very active in the schools, and he was on the school board, and very, very active in the community.
And if I'm not mistaken, parts of that house, disassembled or not, are still on the Sweek House
Yes,
property.
yes, we donated them to
Althea.
Yeah, Althea's daughter
Right.
and husband, yeah.
And just for the people that are listening, the Boone's Smith House was also moved onto that property.
Yes. We'll talk about that later.
And we'll talk about that later. But in an effort to try to restore it, and its restoration is far complete, parts of that house have been used to help keep that house period accurate.
I'm sure.
Yeah. James Luster, the
Well, he was
Luster House is right up here.
He was a young man, just probably 19, 20 years old when he came out, and he drove a ox team for one of the settlers, and he settled up here on Boone's Ferry Road. Of course, he was a single man, and let's see, he died and left his property to somebody in Sherwood. Apparently, that's who he drove for. We're not sure that that's his house, because where my friend Karen lived, That was also on his donation land claim.
Ah.
And that was closer to Boone's Ferry Road, where Luster House was on Saggart Road, kind of. I don't think that road was built at that. We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. But it did have a hook in the fireplace, like I used to cook, you know, with a hook with a pot, iron pot. Yeah, that house does have that. But then he died, and he left his property to somebody in Sherwood.
The next one's one of my favorites. It's a great story. Aaron Meyer.
Well, Aaron Meyer was a Jewish man who took up a land claim in the Tonquin area. But he was a tradesman, and he would go all around the country with his wagon packed and sell goods to the people. And he was well known, well liked. They all liked it when he came, would feed him meals and so on. And he borrowed money from somebody, and Margie told me that. Anyway, and I can't remember what it was. But anyway, then he went on down to California, worked in the iron mines. I don't know what happened to his property, but he came out early.
But people might know that Meyer name in a different way today.
Well, Meyer and Frank, of course.
Right.
Meyer and Frank store in Portland was the big store when I was a kid, you know. We'd, yeah, Margie knows. We'd say, we'll meet you under the clock at Meyer and Frank. That was what we all said. It was a big department store. They're both Jewish people and lovely people.
And Aaron Meyer was one of the founders.
One of the what? Oh, yes, one of the founders of Meyer and Frank. Yes,
Yeah.
I'm sorry I missed that.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing story. Last name on this list, John Sweek. We can't talk about Tualatin without talking about the Sweeks.
That's right, that's right. Well, of course, Sweek House is still standing, and I believe we're on Sweek land right here. They came out in 1852. They got married and came out on the train. Apparently, when they left St. Joe, their boat sank or something. They had to get all the supplies, resupply themselves. Yeah, so they came out and they were young, just newly married, and apparently Semino kind of had a crush on Maria, and she turned him down.
Yeah, then he ended up marrying a Galbraith gal.
What?
He had to take a Galbraith gal instead, huh?
No. Now you're getting me mixed up here.
Okay.
Just wait till
Sorry.
you're 90.
Okay. Okay.
Anyway, Sweeks were very progressive, had a little more money than the rest of the people did, and I believe John Sweek, had some pull with some officials, because in Maria Sweek's diary, which we used to own, we gave to the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they never gave back. She talks about these important people stopping by their cabin.
Mm-hmm.
John Sweek would, where their house is right over here, he would go work on the bridge or the ferry, what was at Oregon City at that time. I can't remember, brakeman or something, I can't remember what the term is. And took his little dog with him. But on the trail, Maria said in her diary that the dog got bad feet from walking on the trail. And so John made little pouches with leather to put on his feet like shoes. So they were a little bit above the rest of the people, maybe they thought, I don't know, but they lived in a cabin, and Maria had all of her children, and he went to the gold mines or silver mines in Idaho with Byram. Mm-hmm. And some of my relatives did too. They came back and they had money then to work on their homes and build their lives up.
Nice. I think many people would be surprised to hear that there were actually steamships on the Tualatin River.
Oh yes, lots of steamships on the Tualatin River. And I was going to save it for next month, but I remember when I was a kid, down by the bridge, you look down there, it's different than it was then, a bunch of us kids walked down there, my mother would have shot me. And there was a floor out there like what am I trying to say? A port, where a dock. a dock is what it was, where ships would stop, or boats would stop, because they had these little steamboats, and they would go from one area to another, taking goods, giving people rides, or would take some eggs over to the store or so on like that. And so that was still there in the 40s.
Do you recall anything or what you had written about the Goodall Potts affair?
That's another thing I found out at the state archives. It's a wonder. If you want to research your ancestors and stuff, be careful, because you might find something you don't want anybody to know. Well, it seems like Goodall thought his wife had had help with having her last child, and kind of accosted this other guy about it. The other guy was Arnspicker's daughter, I think, the woman, and that was on 65th, where Lee Farms is now. Yeah, so there was a big fight over that, and somebody got shot.
Mm-hmm. Over a supposed affair?
Yes.
Okay.
Later on, and he left, later on, it was kind of proven that he was wrong.
Mm-hmm. That she had not had an affair?
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Who wouldn't?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
The Little Red Schoolhouse, if a person does even basic Tualatin history research or curiosity, that comes up a lot.
Yes.
What's up with the Little Red Schoolhouse?
Little Red Schoolhouse was up on Avery Street. As you would drive up Boone's Ferry now, it was just as you turn onto Avery, it was right there on the corner. Mm-hmm. And that's where my grandmother and grandfather went to school. I suppose, I'm not sure, I think it was built in 1870.
But it wasn't the first schoolhouse.
No, the first schoolhouse was on Tualatin, Sherwood Road. Picture. Pardon me, Yvonne, what?
Picture what you're talking about.
Thank you.
And so they started in a cabin on Tualatin Sherwood Road, and then who built the schoolhouse?
Well, the people got together and built it, yeah.
So the county didn't come in and do that for them?
Well, they had sawmills around, mm-hmm. and they had carpenters around. There were lots of people who could do that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. So many of the first settlers' children went to school there.
Yes. My grandmother, all her sisters and brothers went to school there. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And was it the only school in town at that time?
The only school in town after the little log school. And then the new school, it was built in 1900 up on Boone's Ferry, where it was a grade in high school, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to go back to some names, kind of what's considered to be the second wave of settlers, some pretty big names in our community. Juergens.
Juergens were my great-grandparents, and he was from Germany, and he came over with some of his family, and he was a stonemason in Germany, and here he bought the Larkin, the place over there, Levi Anderson's place.
Okay.
He bought that property in 1969. That's when he married my great-grandmother, and she was from Bohemia. But they were close enough that they could kind of understand each other, But they had 11 children. The first one died. So they lived in a cabin, I think, that Levery had probably built until 1880, when there was a huge storm, just like the Columbus Day storm here, and trees, just those enormous old-growth trees just fell down like toothpicks. And so a lot of houses were built at that time from that lumber. And the house that my grandmother was born in she was born in 1881, was from that lumber. The house is still standing on Shasta Drive. And the Juergens were prominent in the Grange and the church and the schools. And my great-grandfather was a musician. He played the fiddle, the upright bass, and the piano.
And just so I'm clear, because this is new to me, I didn't realize there was this big blowdown of the trees, And you said that people use those to build houses?
Well, yeah, a tree is down. If you don't have to cut it down, you just cut the roots off. My dad told me that. And I looked it up, and it's true.
Interesting. Okay. Toziers?
Who?
Tozier? I may not be pronounced.
Tozier. Oh, Tozier came out, and Eddie's came out in the 1860s. And I think they had horses instead of oxen. You know, they used oxen at first on the trail because they're easier to take care of, to feed. They don't need the kind of food that horses do. And they could manage better in the rough land. But they came out on horses. And this Tozier wrote quite a journal on his trip out here. And then he became very prominent in Hillsborough.
Yeah, as a business person?
Yes,
or-
I think so, yeah.
How about the Thompsons?
Well, Thompsons came same time. They were related to the Eddies. The Eddies and the Toziers and the Thompsons came out at the same time.
Okay, that was the next on my list, the Eddies. Was it just a coincidence they came at the same time,
No,
or
I
did they
think
know each other?
They
when
probably
came?
knew each other. How do we know? But they probably did, because I think people did contact people that they knew or ask somebody if they wanted to join them. So they came out together and they had horses. And let's see, Toziers ended up in Hillsborough. Toziers. And Eddie, well, Ezekiel Eddy was, his house was here in Tualatin, right next to where Yvonne used to live, on Tonka Street, and it was a very interesting house, Italianate style, and very interesting. He married one of the Byram girls, and they had no children of their own, and so he left his house to the Blank family, which was his wife's sister's family,
Okay.
and they operated a little dairy there
Oh,
in the
really?
30s.
So whether it was this first wave of land claim people or the big second wave, which happened in the 1870s, some of these other names we've talked about, walk us through what a typical day would be like for a couple on a piece of farm property, agricultural property here in Tualatin. They wake up in the morning, and then what happens?
Well, it depends on what you did for a living. Most of them had cattle, livestock of some kind to feed themselves, you know. So you'd milk the cow and feed the chickens and gather the eggs and that type of thing, clean out the manure.
And then they were done for the day?
Not hardly. Well, you know, most of them were farmers, although there were a few business people starting young businesses, you know, like the Galbraiths at the bridge. They had a store there.
Oh, there was a
There
store
was a
at the
store,
bridge.
and there was a blacksmith shop. Yeah.
Okay.
Because people, and it was a kind of a place to get your mail, because they didn't have, obviously, mail routes. And so mail would be delivered there, and people would come and get something that may be sent from back east.
So were these people just doing mostly subsistence farming? Hard to
Yes.
pronounce. Or were they actually trading some of the product that they put
Well,
out?
it depends on
beef
what
or
they
eggs?
grew, you know. Everybody had different land. I know quite a bit about land. Some of it's fertile, and some of it is not. So some of the people sold hay. Henry Hayes, who settled up in Stafford area, he had the big land claim, and he sold a lot of hay. And Edward Byram worked for him, because Edward Byram came out early too. But you know, I think most of it was subsistence farming.
And if they did have extra product to sell, was it always within the community, or did it go out beyond Tualatin?
To trade, you mean?
Yeah.
To trade goods? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. How can you know that?
Yeah.
You traded with your neighbors, I guess, and they said somebody down the road had something, and you could go trade with them, probably. Oregon City was where you would get any supplies that you needed, you know,
And how did you get to Oregon City?
with your wagon and oxen or horses.
And what road existed between Tualatin and Oregon City?
Well, from Brown's Ferry, the road went across the river. There was a ferry there, and went across the river onto Childs Road and into Oregon City. Then after the Galbraith Bridge was built, by the Boone family, they built a road from Wilsonville into Tualatin, and it crossed the river at Tualatin, which they called Galbraith at that time, and went on into Portland. Part of Boone's Ferry Bridge is still out there, besides what's here.
Now, You mention in your book, or you describe in your book, as 1890 to 1910 being boom years for Tualatin.
Was it ever?
What was happening in Tualatin that would make you use that description?
1892, John L. Smith came to town.
Okay.
And bringing his whole family with him, and they were from the east, but they first settled up in Columbia City or somewhere up there. He was a logger, so he came down and bought a lot of the Galbraith property here and set up a sawmill. It was the first paycheck in town, paychecks in town. Where people could get money instead of just trading.
And people would know the location of that sawmill today.
Well, it's right down on the city park.
On the city
That's
park.
it.
Okay.
And there are still footings and so on from that. My dad knew John L. Smith. Unfortunately, he was killed in 1910 when a stone hit him in the forehead. I know they were logging, it was heavy logging, and something hit him in the head and it knocked him down and killed him. But he was a powerful man, and his whole family lived here. And they used to have a row of houses all along Boone's Ferry, where the senior center is now, and all that. They owned all that. They had a huge, huge horse barn. They had some of the biggest horses in the county. And they had all these houses, and then they owned, where the brick store is on the corner. They owned that, and all the land back, another block. So they owned all of Tualatin. All their family had houses along there, and most of them worked on the sawmill. But one, Lizzie and her husband, Robinson, built a brick store. Oh, that's another thing. As my father would say, and here's another thing. John L. Smith built a sawmill, not only a sawmill, he had a brickyard. And it was down the road a little bit. Yvonne? Yes, Yvonne, I know where it was.
Okay, he had a brickyard also.
What?
So he had the mill and the brickyard.
Mill and a
So he
brickyard.
employed a lot of people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Employed a lot of people. Yeah, he had the only payrolls in town.
Okay. We're gonna stop now at the turn of the century here, because next month we're going to be talking about Tualatin during your lifetime. Starting around, my math's right, around 1935 or so, in the Depression years and all that. But I want to let people know that next month, if you're curious about Tualatin, we would like you to come and see the program next month. It'll be recorded by TVC TV. But if you want to know about what's happening in Tualatin during the Depression and during World War II, and some of the major floods that we had over the years, and also interesting things like the I-5 freeway, there's some great stories about some rascal kids and what they were doing out on the freeway before it was paved, and all kinds of mischievous things that happened. And Loyce, we want to thank you very much for sharing that part of Tualatin history with us, drilling down on some of the people. And we love you and admire you. Thank you for everything you've done for the city.
Thank you.